Well, greetings everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Topic UFO. Today we are extremely lucky to have Mr. Greg Valdez as our guest. Greg is the son of Gabe Valdez. And if you know anything about the Dulce Mesa story, I'm sure you'll recognize that name. Greg has just released a book, I believe, entitled Dulce Base, and he is here tonight to talk to us about it. So, without further ado, as we say, Greg, are you out there?
Yes, and I'd like to thank you for having me on your program. I really appreciate it.
Oh, hey, no problem. I was so thrilled to hear that we could get you on today. So Greg, as I said, your father, Gabe, was a police officer, and correct me if I'm wrong here, he was a police officer in Dulce, New Mexico. And things all kind of started with this story back in the mid-'70s, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. They started in 1976 when he started investigating cattle mutilation mystery up in Dulce as a New Mexico State police officer. Oh,
okay, so he was a state police officer. So why don't you take us from the beginning here. Now, again, the book is called Dulce Base?
Yes, Dulce Base, the truth and evidence from the case files of Gabe Valdez.
Ah, okay, very good. Please, just start off where you want, and we're all ears.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, the story kind of started with the cattle mutilations. The Gomez Ranch, they experienced the first mutilation in 1976. That's how my dad got involved. It kind of turned into one of the hot spots. Dulce, northern New Mexico, Rio Arriba County was one of the hot spots for mutilations back in this time period. Later, what happened is this man named Paul Benowitz, who was he worked down in Albuquerque, became involved in this story about the alleged Dulce Base, which is supposed to be an underground base in around Dulce, New Mexico, kind of emerged. Well, my dad was working with Paul Benowitz, and the whole story's kind of intertwined. And it'd probably take me 12 hours to explain everything in detail. But that's why I wrote the book, came out, because it was easier to just put it in book form. But through these stories, you have the Air Force involved. There's a lot of good information out, but there's also a tremendous amount of bad information on the Dulce Base story. So I took all his files when he passed away a couple of years ago and put it into book form so people will know what really happened and what's true and what's false. My dad lived there. I lived there in Dulce. So a lot of the information that's out there comes from people that, some of them have never even been to Dulce, but for some reason they become an expert on the field. And
yeah, isn't that
set the record straight?
Isn't that amazing how people can write these stories? And so going back now to 1976. There was ranchers out there that were finding, and this is something I've always had a hard time with, Greg. They say they're cattle mutilations, but they're not really mutilated. They are very surgically cut when they find these things, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct. And these ranchers have been in business all their life. They know the difference between predators and natural forms of death. So when they call my dad grew up ranching. They know it wasn't predator, so that was pretty obvious from the beginning. But yes, to answer your question, they were more the incisions, the cuts that we're finding were more surgical and more precise than just a predator eating them, which is one of the theories that kind of floats around. But they discredited that theory a long time ago. It was pretty obvious it wasn't predators.
And so after your dad became involved by, I guess, responding to these reports, did he, what was his thoughts right off the bat? what did he think about this, from the get-go when these cattle mutilations were happening? Did he have any viewpoints on this right away, or?
Well, when they first started happening, what was unusual is they were seeing a lot of, we'll just call them UFO sightings. This strange light was around the same area of Dulce. It was pretty common. Pretty much everyone in the town of Dulce would see this light, or lights, sometimes plural, on any given night. It was that common. And then they'd see the lights flying around different parts of the reservation, and usually the next day they'd find a dead cow or several dead cows. So he was trying to figure out if they were tied together, if it's just a random coincidence. He was a police officer, so he looked at every bit of information he could find. They looked into satanic groups, the occult, local pranksters, predators. They even looked at that. And he just basically looked at everything he could think of and tried to rule out what didn't fit and what did fit, and let the evidence speak for itself.
Yeah, I think a lot of people jump to the conclusion of these satanic groups a lot of times. And I guess the thing that kind of pushes that to the side is the fact that these cuts were made so, surgically precision cuts. And I don't know if the pieces of the cow that were taken, would that be something that a satanic group would usually take? I don't know. So what transpired from there? So we're now in the late 70s. We've had these cattle mutilations. Where did it go from there?
Well, with the cattle mutilations, my dad was always, the evidence always pointed to some type of human involvement, whether it's a military or a large pharmaceutical corporation or something that's well-financed. It had to be well-financed because they were happening nationwide. They weren't just specific to one area. But what he couldn't figure out were these UFO sightings. And that's how he became involved with Paul Bennewitz, because he met Paul in Albuquerque at a conference with Senator Harrison Schmitt at the time, who was an Apollo astronaut.
Oh, okay, yeah.
People remember. But he used to be a senator for New Mexico. And Paul said, hey, it's nice to meet you. You might have an explanation for those lights you're seeing, because I'm seeing them over Kirtland Air Force Base here in Albuquerque. And that's where they became friends, and that's kind of where the Dulce Base story started, is when Paul kind of stumbled on the stuff at Kirtland. My dad was interested in it because he was seeing the same things up in Dulce, what Paul was showing him on film. So they were trying to tie it together, and from there, they say, is history, because there's been books written on the rest of the story, and now there's another book written about it.
So your dad was seeing UFOs or something flying around in the skies of Dulce, and they matched what Paul was capturing.
Yes.
Now, from what I understand, now Paul was a publicly known ufologist, was he not?
He started off in his early interest in UFOs. He was involved, I believe he was involved with MUFON. Don't quote me on that. But I think early on he started off involved in UFO studies, like groups like MUFON. And then he showed up at the conference, so obviously he was interested in it, because that was more of a law enforcement conference. It wasn't like typically like one of these UFO cons or one of the ones that they have nowadays. That was more geared towards cattle mutilations and law enforcement in general. So, but he showed up at it regardless, and that's kind of where they hit it off.
Yeah. Do you know what your dad's thoughts were at that time as far as UFOs?
He was open-minded, because that's what a cop does. It's any type of investigation. I became a police officer, so I know his rationale for whether it's a murder or any type of crime. To find a suspect, you eliminate suspects till you get down to the one. Does
right.
That make sense? So he always had an open mind. He looked at every single thing he could think of, but it always seemed to come back towards government involvement at one time or another, or human involvement.
Now, this for the folks, because this show is seen worldwide. Where is Dulce located? And the mesa, we call it Dulce Mesa, I believe. Is that the same as Archuleta Mesa, or are those two different things, two different locations?
There's a lot of confusion on it, but yes, essentially Dulce is located on at the base of Archuleta Mesa.
Okay.
Now, to add more confusion to you, the story of the Dulce Base was based off of Mount Archuleta, which is a different mountain. So it was easy to filter out investigators, because a lot of them would come in and say, hey, the base is up on Archuleta Mesa. Well, the story never started from that. It always started from Mount Archuleta, which is in a different location.
Is that right?
Confusing. Yes.
I never knew that. I never knew that. I mean, even the shows you see on television always talk about Archuleta Mesa.
Yeah, and that's what the book separates. And to answer your question, it's basically on the Colorado-New Mexico state line.
Okay, got you.
What was surprising about Paul is, like we mentioned earlier, he wasn't from Dulce. He knew nothing about Dulce. So he kind of gets involved in the story. And there was a lot of other people, UFOologists from around the country, would come to Dulce and they'd talk to my dad. They'd come and eat at the house and whatever the case. But what was interesting about Paul is he was giving my dad accurate information about Dulce. And he could never figure out where he was getting this information. Of course, Time Letter told that he was getting it from the Air Force directly. But at the time, my dad didn't know where he was getting it. So essentially, about 80% of the information he was giving my dad was true, and about 20% of it was false. And it was just a matter of sorting out what was correct from what was wrong. And that's always been the challenge in this story.
Now, again, my understanding is that the Air Force was giving Benowitz information. But why were they giving him this information?
It's a pretty long story, but he stumbled onto one of their projects at Kirtland Air Force Base. So part of it was to get him distracted from what was going on at Kirtland and draw him away. And so a lot of it was a distraction technique. And Greg Bishop documents it in his book Project Beta. A lot of what he probably stumbled onto.
Oh, okay.
So they gave him another project, which is Dulce. And that's where he was getting the partial truth, because they were giving him half-truths, and the trick is to figuring out what part of it was true and what part of it was false, and that's always been the challenge about the Dulce story.
And so now your book, Dulce Base, does it clear up a lot of these half-truths or half-unknowns, half-knowns?
Yes, it separates all of them.
Wow.
And it's documented with evidence. If it's in the book where we know something didn't happen or did happen, you can go to the website and see where the proof is for that. Or you can go to other, sources of information on Dulce and see why they're either telling the truth or they're not telling the truth, because I have all the documents that supports everything in the book.
Now, did your father, did he ever get visits by the government?
I guess you could say that. We found a listening device inside the house, so they tapped the phones. Of course, this was the day of the rotary phones, before the digital phones. So
much easier to do back then, yeah.
Yeah, but they used the magnet. They just placed it underneath the rotary phone, and they also tapped the phone of one of the ranchers there in Dulce who was having a lot of mutilations, and that's how they found it. The rancher's family found it. And so when they reported it to my dad brought the listening devices, and my mom told him, hey, I found one of those the other day, too. I thought it was a piece to the kids' toys. And he asked her, where'd you find it? He goes, right here underneath the phone. So they were listening. We went and my dad activated it using Howard Burgess, who was a scientist that was helping him at the time. And sure enough, they worked. He plugged them in, and he had me and my brothers go in the back room, and we were testing it out. We were talking in one room, and they recorded everything clear as day. So they were keeping tabs on them.
Okay, so now I'm even more confused than I was a half an hour ago. Let me ask you now. So is the whole story on Dulce, this underground, supposed underground base, Is that just a total made-up story to cover up some other government project?
Yeah, to keep it simple, yes. If it makes it easier for you to understand, when Dulce, if you're talking about aliens, that part of the story is false. But they did have an off-site testing facility. They were testing a lot of aircraft, and some other things were going on up there. So I call it in the book, I reference the Dulce Base as Area 52, because that's what the evidence points to, that it was another one of the government's off-site testing facilities for advanced military aircraft and some of their projects that were going on. And the book has evidence because they were able to get photographs and some other stuff that proved this was correct.
So now, what happens to the cattle mutilations? What was that all about?
Well, some people aren't familiar with the story around Dulce, the area. It goes back to what's called the Project Plowshare, which was a peaceful uses for atomic energy that was started after World War II. Well, they detonated an atomic bomb underground at Project Gas Boogie, which is right outside of Dulce, 22 miles approximately. So one of the headaches with Project Gas Boogie is it was leaking nuclear contamination, and it was designed to open up oil and gas streams so that El Paso Natural Gas could go in and sell the gas. Well, they had so much radioactive contamination, they just ended up capping the well, but they did have a leak, and they flared off all the contaminated gas. Well, the flaring doesn't necessarily get rid of the radioactive contaminants. It just burns the gas off, so it was released into the air, and this was back in '67, I believe. So that's part of it, and that's where the mutilations kind of tied in, because the mutilations looked like they were testing, the early ones they were testing for contamination, radioactive type contamination. Then it looked in later like they were getting more into like biogerm warfare type issues, because this is the evidence that was found at the death sites for whatever you want to call it. And then the later mutilations in the 90s, it looked like it was turning into more of a weapons development type of program.
And that all sounds, very doable. But why would the government have to do it in such a clandestine type of way? Why would they have to go to some rancher and steal his cattle, or sneak in, sneak out type of thing? Couldn't they do it not in a public way, but do they have to do it in such?
I know what you're saying, because I get that question all the time, so I think I understand what you're trying to say. There's a lot of issues here. The government actually did do that at the Nevada test site. They call it the Animal Investigative Program, where they had their own cattle herd and they were subjecting them to radiation and testing them. The problem with areas such as Dulce is they had always told everyone there's no contamination, don't worry about it. So there's liability issues you got to deal with, because if they're the ones releasing the contamination, then they have to go out and clean it up. What supported this is the fact that, like, the Gomez herd was hit repeatedly. I think they had 17 mutilations. And they started noticing a pattern. The animals that had been in the area for several generations, that were indigenous to the area with genetic bloodlines, those seemed to be the target of the mutilations. They used to summer pasture around 10,000 head of steers from Texas every year. None of those cattle were ever killed. It was always the local cattle that had, several generations of bloodlines in the area. So that's where it started pointing back. And there's some other issues to explain that, but it's a long explanation. But that's one of the main reasons why they figured they were using certain cattle and that had a genetic tie to the area.
Yeah, makes sense. So where does the story of the underground alien base under this mesa come from? And then the other question, the story about the folks that were drilling in to the side of the mountain and supposedly broke into a cavernous area where supposedly aliens were conducting experiments. Have you heard those two stories? I'm sure you have.
Yeah. Someone just created the story about them digging into the side of the mountain. That's never been verified. We lived there. You know, my dad was there for almost 20 years. So that was never, that's one of the side stories that's kind of popped up. And to answer your first question, the Air Force actually started that story, and there's documents to show they're the ones that started the story about Dulce. You have two other stories that have kind of popped up, is the Thomas Costello and Phil Schneider,
right,
who are supposed whistleblowers that worked in the area. Those are also false, and I have documents to show why those are false and where they came from. But there's kind of two different things going on in those two stories. But the book clarifies so that people can understand why those stories aren't correct.
So now I'm not familiar with a Costello, but Schneider, I mean, he was very public, you know, went on these speaking engagements, right? And told these amazing stories of getting into battles with these aliens underground. And I mean, why do you think someone would do that? Do you think they're just mentally impaired? Do you think they're looking for some type of fame, financial gain? What are your thoughts when you hear stories like that, and you know, supposedly can prove that they're not true?
Well, on the Schneider story, that one's pretty simple. Just to give you a heads up, if you ever hear anything about an underground alien battle, what a lot of people don't realize is the Air Force started that story, not Phil Schneider or Thomas Costello. The Air Force started it. They passed it to Paul Benowitz, and I have documents. See, these documents have never been released. They've been kept within the kind of close-knit investigators so that the investigators could tell who was telling the truth, if they're legitimate. It's a way of screening out these people that would come out of the woodwork.
I got you.
It's a good way to filter, and it worked good on Phil's case. When Phil died, his ex-wife, Cynthia Dreyer, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name. Anyway, his ex-wife started contacting my dad. So she's sending him all this information and pretty much promoting the same story. But her story fell apart pretty quick. And then the next thing that started happening, she was asking for money. So to answer your story, a lot of that stuff was based off financial stuff. In my website, the book goes into detail why the story fell apart and why it wasn't accurate. And that's a good way, since you brought it up, a good way how to filter some of these Dulce stories. If you hear anything about an underground alien firefight, that was started by the Air Force as part of the spin story that they were giving, and it was given to Paul. So after that, after the fact, there's been a lot of different things written on that, but that's a good way to just filter it right off the bat. If they talk about an underground alien war or whatever the case in '79, you're pretty much guaranteed it's a false story from there on, because that came from the Air Force, and I have documents that show it.
Well, you know what I find amazing is that you know, you always hear stories of the government giving out false information to cover other type of things, and you know, it appears to me that this is this is one of those situations. So the project that they were trying to cover up, was it just strictly a military project? I mean, it had nothing to do with UFOs or anything else, right?
Well,
or did it?
The main thing is it was a classified military aircraft that they were testing up there. And people will say, well, how do you know that? I was like, well, we took pictures of it. Just a tip for anyone that's in any type of UFO hotspot or Area 51, it might apply up there, but I know for sure in Dulce is the camera lens would pick up this aircraft, but your naked eye couldn't see it. So we just take random photos of the mountaintops when we were up in a hotspot. And when we go develop them, these mystery aircraft would appear on the film that we never see while we were up there. We were just kind of luck of the draw. We had that one of these photos was enhanced at Los Alamos Labs through some kind of side connections that my dad had, and they were able to get the insignia off of it. Of course, that photo was quickly taken away because then they realized they stumbled onto some military aircraft training, high-tech, very high-tech, because this is in the 85, mid-80s, and they already had this aircraft that was silent and invisible for the most part. So, but it wasn't an alien per se. It was one of the military's top projects at the time. So who knows what's replaced it since now, because this has been quite a while since they've had that technology.
And what are your personal thoughts on the whole UFO phenomenon, Greg? Do you believe that there truly are UFOs flying around up there, or do you feel that it's all government stuff? What are your thoughts?
Well, my expertise is Dulce, because I grew up there and I've seen so many different things. So as far as Dulce is concerned, that's all government. Everything points to that. But here's the kicker to that, is you have stuff going on worldwide, and it's a very legitimate question. Well, this doesn't explain what happened in South America, and it doesn't. And so I didn't investigate it, so it's hard for me to tell if there's aliens down in Brazil or South America, because I'm not an expert on it. That's the problem with some of these stories, is people that don't know enough about the area have kind of put in their 2 cents where they don't verify it.
Yeah, it's more of personal...
their interpretation.
Exactly. Exactly.
So everything I've seen as far as Dulce, a lot of the stuff in New Mexico, it points back to military government. And there's a timeline, and it fits in good. There's declassified documents, and it explains a lot of this in detail. Like, of course, we didn't know it back then, but now it's real obvious. Where you read some of this stuff like, oh, that makes sense. That's what they were doing up in Dulce or Kirtland or whatever the case. So as far as the Dulce story, that's all tied into military and government stuff. Now, as far as the other stuff, it's possible, and any good investigator never rules anything out. Mm-hmm. It's just we've never seen anything in the Dulce area that points towards aliens.
Now, I know there's an Indian reservation just outside of Dulce, right? Or
it's actually on the reservation.
It's on the reservation.
Yes.
And have those folks out there on the reservation I've been reporting UFOs over the years? I know I've seen things on different television shows where they've interviewed some of those folks, but after speaking to you, it changes so much about the story. It amazes me how a story can grow.
It's good and bad. Sometimes it's good, but sometimes it's bad.
Well, yeah, I mean,
on who's adding to it,
Exactly, and I think people that are truly into ufology to look for answers, not stories. They're looking for answers. That's what I go after anyway. If this could happen at Dulce, it could surely happen at a lot of different places as well. But that still doesn't, rule out, like you said, what happened at these nuclear missile sites in Montana when they were UFOs spotted and the ICBMs all shut down. Was that a government thing? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell. So that's why I stick to what I know, and I think that's what gets a lot of people in trouble. They try to get out of their expertise, and I know Dulce, I know everything about it. And if people want to contact me, they have new evidence, maybe they find aliens in Dulce, I'll help them prove it, because of my knowledge of the area. I can tell them, well, no, this is probably true, or yes, it is true or false, whatever the case, because of it takes locals to have that knowledge of first of all, the story and the area.
Absolutely.
And to answer your early question, I'm sorry I didn't answer the early one. The tribal members, almost everyone in Dulce has seen those lights at one time or another, but just because their culture, they're very reserved, the Native American culture, they wouldn't report it to outside sources like MUFON or the news media or whatever the case, but they would report it to my dad because they trusted him, and he worked there, lived there, he had their trust. So to answer your early question, pretty much everyone in Dulce has seen these lights at one time or another. It's just getting them to talk about it's a different story unless they trust you or if they know you.
Right. They view you kind of as an outsider. So now, is there, excuse me, is there information in your new book, Dulce Base? Is there information in there that has never been seen before or never been discussed before, or is it is it information that has been out before and you're just presenting it in a certain way?
It's a little bit of both. There's actually a lot of new stuff. There's a lot of old stuff that I clarified and told the true story of what happened, because some of it's turned into rumors or gossip, or they've kind of strayed from the original story.
Mm-hmm.
So I've gotten it back on, hopefully gotten it back on track. And that's what the book was for, just to set the record straight. So some of the old stuff, I've clarified what really happened on some of these stories that are somewhat famous in regards to Dulce. And there's a lot of new stuff. A lot of people didn't know about that aircraft because of it being so classified. And this is what a lot of people don't realize is a key part of this story is the National Institute for Discovery Science, is NIDS. I don't know if you've heard of them or not.
No.
But Robert Bigelow owns the Bigelow Aerospace.
Right.
NIDS was set up back in the 90s to kind of investigate UFOs, catamulations, any type of strange paranormal activity. So they hired all these top investigators from all over the country, basically. They gave them money to MUFON to kind of, excuse me, to do research with MUFON. They had investigators working with MUFON, and they hired my dad. Well, see, the headache about NIDS is they made them all sign a non-disclosure agreement, well, at least my dad and several of the other ones. So a lot of this stuff he couldn't talk about, because what they did is he worked there for a couple of years, and then after he worked there, they're like, oh, you have to sign this non-disclosure agreement. And you know how that goes. I don't want to really get into that.
Right.
So, but that tied his hands on a lot of the stuff that he could release towards the later part of his life, the last several years, because he found out a lot more after the fact, but he just legally he couldn't release it. It used to frustrate him like you wouldn't believe, because to him he solved it. It's a case that's been going on for 40 years almost.
Well,
he couldn't say nothing about it.
Didn't Bigelow and maybe this NIDS group, why they were out looking for the next generation of propulsion. And that's why they wanted to know about UFOs. Because they figured they could make money off of it. Is that kind of the background of Bigelow and his?
That's part of it. The book goes into. I try to go into detail, but I have to watch how I say it.
Okay, I got you.
Book, but in the book, you should be able to figure it out. It should be crystal clear after you read the book on what that means, and that's a lot of the newer stuff, like we were talking about earlier. Is there new stuff? And if you can get that concept from that chapter on NIDS, the light bulbs would just come on. You're like, oh, now it all makes sense.
All right. Well, listen, Greg, we're just about out of time here, but I wanted to ask you, your new book, Dulce Base. Where can people get it? It'll be on the website dulcebasebook.com, and hopefully by the end of this week it'll be on Amazon and some of the other retailers like iTunes. I'm still working out the kinks on those, and I know people are frustrated waiting for it, but the website will be the main place, dulcebasebook.com. Okay, and has it come out already, or is it, it's available right now on dulcebasebook.com, right? Or is
the website's it's almost done. I have a bunch of copies. I did a pre-release in Dulce a couple of weeks ago just because that would have been important to my dad to get the story out to the people from Dulce, because it's about them.
Right,
Right. so I got the early copies were up to them, and I have copies here. It's just getting them out to people is always the fun part. And so Amazon and the website will provide that opportunity.
Oh, excellent. And I also understand from an event that was sent to me by Norio Hayakawa, you have something coming up on August 17th, some type of speaking engagement?
Yes, here in Albuquerque, Norio's been great, helping me out as much as he could. So I really owe him a big thank you.
Great guy.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a speaking engagement here in Albuquerque to explain more details from the Dulce story and talk to people face to face so they can kind of get back on track on what really happened. I did a little talk about a year ago. It was more of a question and answer type thing, and it worked. It went really well. But that was one of the reasons I kind of wrote the book, because I realized there's a lot of confusion out there. Because some of the questions I was getting, I realized there's really a lot of bad information floating around. So it's good to kind of get people back on track on what really happened. So I will be giving a presentation on the 17th here in Albuquerque, and Norio has the information, and I'll post it on the website, and we'll get that information out and running. So if anyone's in Albuquerque, it's free. So we look forward to seeing anyone if they can show up and make it.
All right, excellent. Well, Greg, I can't tell you how interesting of a conversation this has been. I mean, it really has. I think, what you've done here is just a great thing, because we need to be dealing with facts. These stories, although romantic at times, we're not going to proceed in the field of ufology following stories. We need the facts. So thank you very much for putting this together. Thanks for talking to us today. And good luck on the 17th and on your book overall.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you having me on the show.
All right, very good. Greg, you have a great rest of the day, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Answer is